Watch Your Head by Stephen D. Jackson.
Eleanor's hand was hot and sweaty in my hand, and as I walked at her pace along the deserted country lane, my mind kept returning to what horrors might be lurking in the tiny, unclean palm of an excited 6-year-old. A 6-year-old who had spent the last 3 hours at a Halloween party with other sweet-gobbling, sugar-wired 6-year-olds. My daughter chattered and sang happily to my left, practically dancing by my side in her adorable pink, now with unexplained splotches, fairy costume. Her voice sounded far too loud to my city boy ears. After living my entire life in the bustling, endlessly noisy suburbs of London, the subdued quiet of Oak Hill, our new home, was almost painful. Eleanor's childish chatter seemed to surround us like a little beacon of sound lighting up the silent darkness. I imagined 1,000 unseen creatures watching with breathless anticipation, drawn to my daughter's singing, her vulnerability, her innocence. I shuddered and tried to concentrate instead on what she was saying. In reality, of course, the night wasn't all that dark, nor particularly silent. The sun wasn't long set, and the moon was bright in the clear sky. It was only the overhanging trees on either side of the lane that made it so dark, and I could hear the distant rumbling of the main road only a mile or so away. I knew I tended to exaggerate negative thoughts. My oh-so-well-informed wife had explained as much to me shortly after I had lost the argument about moving down here. It was the self-help child-raising book she read all day long, I was sure of it. Her determination to be a brilliant mother had almost taken over her life, and I was considering misplacing the books amongst the many as-yet unpacked boxes. It would be worthwhile if only to spare me another amateur psychology assessment. Eleanor had stopped moving, her hand suddenly tighter in mine. Her singing had stopped. I looked down at her, trying hard to recall what she'd been saying. She could be petulant at times, especially when she thought people weren't paying attention to her incessant rambling narrative. She wasn't even looking at me. Her eyes, brown like her mother's, were wide and staring. I turned and looked in the same direction, not liking the fearful expression on her face. There was no movement in the thick shadows of the trees, but even so I felt anger rise up within me on the tide of adrenaline. The thought that someone was out there trying to frighten my little girl blocked out rational thought. "What is it, honey?" I said gruffly, my eyes on the dark tree line. "He's watching us," she whispered, squeezing my hand tighter and moving close to me. I could feel her body heat against my leg, and my heartbeat increased as though her proximity had heightened my protective instincts. Then I saw it. Through the gap in the trees I could see a figure. The field beyond stretched away up the short hill, the crest clearly visible against the moonlit sky. And perched atop the hill, standing thin and skeletal in the ghostly pale light, was a scarecrow, looking very much worse for wear. My daughter was right. It seemed to be watching us. It looked like it was made of old sticks held loosely together with rope, bits of ragged cloth flapping lazily in the light breeze. At some point, long, long ago perhaps, it had been a genuine scarecrow, but it seemed to have lost its dignity around the time that it lost its purpose. I had to admit it was a creepy sight, sprawled like an impaled corpse, half upright and forgotten. One gnarled, twig hand upturned to an uncaring night like a beseeching claw. But its head, no more than a rounded blob in silhouette, seemed to stare at us from its peculiar bent-over angle. "He can't see us, honey," I said softly, watching the motionless figure as it, in turn, watched us. "He can." "No, sweetie. He's just a bundle of sticks." "But it's Halloween, Daddy," she said in her most condescending voice. "All the monsters come out tonight." Cursing the combination of Hollywood and Disney that I held responsible for this particular notion, I tried not to sigh. Instead, I nodded sagely and tried to look thoughtful. "Well, even if the monsters come out tonight, They can't hurt us because we're good people. And he, I turned and pointed at the scarecrow, was made of sticks by a farmer to keep birds off his field. He isn't a monster. He looks like a monster. Again, I nodded and agreed because she was right. The damn thing did look like a monster, even to me. Goodness only knows what it looked like to a 6-year-old, on Halloween no less. Shall we go home, sweetie? We can have some of your treats before bed and... No! Her tone was so sharp, so sure of itself that I almost started in amazement. I studied her face, but she wasn't showing signs of having a tantrum, or getting into that blazing hysteria that I was sure bubbled permanently under the surface of all small children. She only looked determined. No? I asked softly, peering at her closely. We can't go home while he's watching. And there it was, perfect logic resulting from the combination of self-preservation and the belief in magic and monsters. Parenthood was trickier than I'd been led to believe. Destroy the magic, and you ruin innocence. And Christmas. Try and get around the logic without destroying the magic, and you sound completely irrational. What kind of maniac turns his back on a dangerous creature? The tendrils of an idea floated past my mind, and I grabbed at them. Well, then let's go stop him watching us, shall we? He's just a scarecrow, honey. He won't mind us turning his head the other way. Bizarrely, this suggestion elicited a smile and a nod. My daughter, it would seem, was no coward. Even my skin crawled slightly at the thought of approaching the hunched skeletal figure on the hill, and yet Eleanor seemed up for it. I sighed. I'd made my horrible, creepy bed. Time to lie in it and not think of coffins. I turned towards the shadows and made my way toward the tree line. Thankfully, there were no bushes or thick foliage. Only a small ditch separated the path from the trees. Eleanor giggled as I lifted her over. Shaking my head with a bemused smile, I followed her as she ran over the moonlit grass toward the leering scarecrow. I suppose that as Halloween adventures went, this one was up there with the best. Up close, the thing looked far less threatening. It stood hunched over, forlorn and crippled. Its arms stuck out in peculiar angles, the bonds of the ropes joining them loose and frayed. The head, what was left of it, was some kind of rotting vegetable stuck on a neck stick tied to the back stick. Its weight was such that it bent the whole structure over, giving it the hunched look of a man sleeping whilst shackled. It took me a few moments of staring at the head shape, trying to make it out in the moonlight, before I realized that of course it was a long-dead pumpkin. The mottled spots of some kind of hideous mold crept across the shrunken surface, and it had sunken in on itself to such an extent that much of it had simply fallen apart. The ground by the thing's central post was covered in smaller chunks, mostly rotted to nothing, which must have sloughed away from the scarecrow's decaying head, leaving glistening wet holes in the remainder. Eleanor did not seem fazed by the revolting sight, or the faint, sickly sweet smell of decay wafting from the figure. She had found a stick from somewhere, and was prodding the thing in morbid fascination. With each prod, the pale skin of the pumpkin bent and split a little more, its rank innards dripping disgustingly onto the grass. Stop that, honey, you'll make it... With a ghastly sucking noise, the pumpkin split in half, each section flopping wetly apart and falling heavily to the ground. Eleanor let out a little shriek and dropped her stick as she danced out of range of the flying chunks exploding from the scarecrow's diseased head. I couldn't suppress a laugh. Well, now he won't be able to see us anymore, right, sweetie? The little girl looked up at me, wavering somewhere between smiling and crying. I seized the initiative and gave her a huge smile. Let's go home, shall we? Eleanor, apparently deciding that going home was preferable to a meltdown in the middle of the field, nodded and started walking back toward the path. I followed, giving the headless stick man one final glance. I paused, looked back at it. Free of the weight of the rotting pumpkin, the stick that had pierced it, the neck, had risen upward. The arms tied to the central pole had lowered. The counterweight holding them up had been removed. I knew this, and yet I couldn't help the thought flashing across my mind. It looked somehow indignant, alert, as though standing straighter in disbelief that anyone could have the temerity to remove its head. "Eleanor, wait for Daddy," I called, jogging a few paces to catch up with her. She'd almost made it through the tree line to the path home, but she paused by the ditch to let me catch her. As I set her down after another lift over the muddy water, she looked back at the scarecrow. "Did he fall down, Daddy?" I glanced around, reaching out for her hand. It looked as though the pile of sticks had indeed fallen over. I could no longer see its silhouette against the sky. "I think so, honey. We moved its head and it must have loosened the ropes." Eleanor's hand squeezed suddenly in mine, her body rigid as she stared past me at something behind us on the path. I heard a clicking sound, like the snapping of twigs underfoot in a forest. The sound of straining ropes creaking. I whirled around, catching only a glimpse of a dark, hunched figure as it reached out, impossibly fast, before something heavy cracked into the side of my head and black stars exploded across my vision. From somewhere far away I could hear Eleanor running, her steps soft and rapid. She was screaming for her father. I was on the ground, my vision slowly clearing as sense returned. Meters away, the headless scarecrow staggered and lurched in the darkness after Eleanor, rocking on its uncertain legs and uttering a hideous moaning sound. I lost sight of it as I pushed to my feet, my ears ringing, my limbs numb and unresponsive. I forced them to cooperate as I half tripped and stumbled forward, shouting my daughter's name in a strangled cry. Up ahead, Eleanor's scream rose to a fevered pitch, blending with a ghastly guttural laugh that filled me with terror. Eleanor fell silent, and I screamed in primal fear at what that might signify, my unwilling legs finally regaining their strength as my foot landed on something soft. I stopped, frantically searching the ground with wide, frenzied eyes. There! It was a shoe, a soft, satiny shoe from a fairy costume. 1,000 thoughts and denials rose up within me as my fractured mind tried to think. A distant cry reached me from back the way I'd come, a horrible, wet scream. I spun and ran back to the gap in the trees where we first seen the hanging figure, and reaching the spot, fell to my knees and wailed in soul-rending horror. On the hill, against the moonlit sky, the scarecrow had a new head.
This has been Watch Your Head by Stephen D. Jackson. This story is reproduced here with the permission of the author. A link to the full text and the author's website are available in the description box below. If you have an original short story you would like us to consider reading, please email it to thefleetingword@gmail.com.